Welcome to Leaf Status Report for January 15th, 2026. As always, I've simulated the rest of the NHL regular season 11,000 times, with the Leafs' performances across all simulated seasons forming this distribution. Yesterday, we were focused on only one key game. Unfortunately, that game did go about as bad as it could have gone, at least if you were a Leafs fan. The Buffalo Sabres won that game 5-2, which is going to put them ahead of the Leafs in today's projections. It is worth mentioning that, as we will see when we get to the table, the Leafs are still in a projected playoff spot. The Leafs lose 0.1 expected points today, going from 94.72 yesterday to 94.62 today. In addition to this, based on the theoretical value of expected points I've calculated for today, I'm also projecting that our simulations collectively overestimate the Leafs today by about 0.02 expected points. As always, it's not a ridiculously large margin of overestimation, but it is something. Now, of course, because the Leafs didn't play a game last night, we only have two controllable factors to worry about for expected points change. Substituting all of yesterday's game data into today's simulations yielded a net loss of 0.04 expected points, and we had an additional overtime game today compared to yesterday's simulations, which gives us back 0.03 expected points. Overall, our change in expected points due to controllable factors is a net loss of 0.01 expected points, which ends up meaning that randomness favors the Leafs by 0.09 expected points less than it did yesterday. Out of all simulations conducted today, the minimum number of points the Leafs score in a season is 70, and the maximum number of points they've scored in a season is 115. That gives us an absolute range today of 45 points. Our inner 70% interval remains the same as it did yesterday, with our 15th percentile Leaf season still sitting at 89 points, and our 85th percentile Leaf season still sitting at 100 points. Our standard deviation continues to inch down ever so slightly. Yesterday it was 5.53 points, and today it's dropped down to 5.48 points. The Leafs lose another 2.8% on their playoff odds today. Yesterday, they made the playoffs in 55.3% of all simulations, and today they've made the playoffs in 52.5% of all simulations. Our 95% confidence interval for our playoff odds remains roughly the same as it was yesterday, still sitting at plus or minus 0.93%. Interestingly enough, the Leafs Cup odds actually go up slightly today. The Leafs managed to win the Stanley Cup in 1.85% of all simulations yesterday, and they've managed to win it in 1.86% of all simulations today. As a result of the Leafs Cup odds going up and playoff odds going down over yesterday, the Leafs conditional Cup odds also increase. Out of all simulations where the Leafs qualify for the playoffs, they managed to win the Stanley Cup in 3.54% of them today. Looking at our placing distribution for the Leafs today, there's not really any major changes here. Really, the only thing I can minorly highlight is the fact that we are seeing the entire distribution just flatten out a little bit. I think really the only placing that's a little more skewed than it was yesterday, or the only two placings that are a little more skewed than they were yesterday, are our extreme positions. A1, because the Tampa Bay Lightning continue to inch away from the Leafs every single time the Leafs lose expected points, and wildcard 10 because the New York Rangers, who are currently looking like a lock for last place in Eastern Conference, got 8 goals dropped on them by the Ottawa Senators yesterday. So needless to say, the Leafs are looking pretty confident that they're not going to finish in at least dead last. Looking at the table, generally the only major change we care about in the table over yesterday is the fact that the Buffalo Sabres managed to leapfrog 3 different teams, one of which happens to be the Leafs, to knock the Leafs down into a projected wildcard 2 spot. However, the Leafs' playoff prospects don't actually change all that much from this. Their margin inside the playoffs is still hovering at about 1.4 expected points like it was yesterday, and that threshold team to drop out of the playoffs is still the Pittsburgh Penguins. There were 2 other games that involved Eastern Conference teams yesterday. You could argue the Ottawa Senators game is somewhat influential. It does drop them from a 5.7-ish expected points behind the Leafs, down to a little over 4.4 expected points behind the Leafs. But that margin is still wide enough that it's going to take a couple days of bad performances before the Sens can really expect to close in on that gap in our projections. The Rangers do lose a huge gap from that game as well, having had 8 goals hung on them. However, they're already so far behind the Leafs that it doesn't really affect anything in our playoff odds. The New Jersey Devils also played last night. They closed from 7.15 down to 6.04, but again, that gap is still a bit too wide for us to really be all that worried about them yet. If we have a lot of unideal results in the next couple days, maybe we will start worrying about them again, but not for now. There are about 5 key games to look at tonight in the NHL, and since the Leafs are playing, we will start there. At 9:30 p.m., we get the Auston Matthews-Mitch Marner reunion, but unfortunately they aren't on the same team. The Vegas Golden Knights will be hosting the Toronto Maple Leafs at 9:30. Looking at the raw numbers to start, the Leafs have a little less than a 45% chance of winning this game. Funny enough, Bing Sports actually agrees with me on those odds. I did check. Their expected points yield, which Bing Sports does not carry, is 1.04, according to my simulations. Since the Leafs are hanging at about a little over 1 expected point for this game, I don't think we'd be too disappointed with an overtime loss, just as long as our other 4 games don't go horrifically. As for the minutiae of that game, I'm pretty sure that given that it's the Leafs and they are playing one of their former players, Mitch Marner's either going to hang a hat trick on them or he's going to have a giveaway that ends up leading to the Leafs scoring the game-winning goal. There is no in-between, I swear to God. As for the other 4 key games, I think we can kind of split them into 2 categories. There's all the Metropolitan teams and Buffalo. So we'll start with Buffalo because it's a smaller one. At 7 p.m., the Buffalo Sabres host the Montreal Canadiens. Buffalo has an expected points yield for this game of 1.16, which I think is a pretty good sign for us. Generally, what I'm going to say is that the Leafs want a game outcome 1 point or more better than Buffalo if they want to pass Buffalo tomorrow. If, for example, the Leafs get 1 more point than Buffalo in their respective game, I think it's a toss-up as to which team is on top in tomorrow's standings. If the Leafs win in regulation and Buffalo loses in regulation, I think the Leafs are almost certainly ahead of Buffalo tomorrow. And I think, obviously, if the Leafs fall even on points for their game or get less points than Buffalo, Buffalo will obviously be ahead on tomorrow's table. As for our 3 Metropolitan teams we're worried about, Pittsburgh, the Islanders, and the Caps, provided that the Leafs can take their game to at least overtime. If Pittsburgh loses in any fashion, no questions asked, the Leafs hold their playoff spot, and Pittsburgh cannot catch them. If Pittsburgh does win, then I think we need to start worrying about the other 2 teams. Washington sits a little over 0.4 expected points ahead of the Leafs right now, so an overtime loss for both teams isn't quite enough to guarantee the Leafs get pushed ahead of the Caps, but I think it's thin enough that we don't really care if the Leafs are outside of a playoff spot if their margin outside the playoffs is like 0.05 expected points. So I think we're fine with Washington losing in any fashion as well. As for the Islanders have an expected points yield of 0.99, so we need them to probably lose by a decent margin for the Leafs to also guarantee to pass them with only an overtime loss. I'd reckon we want them to lose by at least 2 or 3 goals if we A, want the Leafs to pass them, and B, aren't relying on anything better than the Leafs just being able to take the Golden Knights to overtime. Looking at the Canadian teams, overall, the prospects of all the Canadian teams to make or miss the playoffs don't really change all that much, both on the table and in my humble opinion. Calgary and Vancouver never win the Stanley Cup in any simulation today, but the Canadian teams do collectively increase their playoff odds, having won the Stanley Cup in 9.49% of all simulations combined.